Okay. So mistaken. So mistaken versus wrong consciousnesses. All right. Mistaken consciousnesses are mistaken with respect to their appearing objects. Right. So all conceptual consciousnesses are necessarily mistaken consciousnesses, because all conceptual consciousnesses are mistaken with respect to their appearing objects, because their appearing objects are mental images rather than the object itself. Whereas wrong consciousnesses are mistaken with respect to their object of engagement. Which is the object itself, right? So wrong consciousnesses are really what create problems for us. Mistaken consciousnesses can be very useful, and we actually cultivate conceptual consciousnesses deliberately on the path, right? It's said that we need to understand emptiness conceptually before we can realize it non-conceptually. And even the inferential realization of emptiness is something that we're striving for, but it's a mistaken consciousness. It's still mistaken, but it's not wrong. So a realizing consciousness can even be a mistaken consciousness. So this is an important distinction. But mistaken consciousnesses still have an element of error in them, which is why we need to ultimately go beyond them. So if it's a mistaken consciousness, it's not necessarily a wrong consciousness. But if it's a wrong consciousness, it's necessarily a mistaken consciousness. Sure. So a mistaken consciousness is not necessarily a wrong consciousness. For example, the inferential realization of emptiness. It's a mistaken consciousness because it's conceptual. Its appearing object is the mental image of emptiness. For a real life example. Or you can just say, any thought. Even the thought of bodhicitta is a mistaken consciousness because it's conceptual. The thought of pizza is a mistaken consciousness because it's conceptual and has a mental image as its appearing object. But it's not necessarily a wrong consciousness. So for the example of a thought of pizza, what is the appearing object? It's the mental image of a pizza. So that's why it's mistaken with respect to its appearing object. Whereas the object of engagement of that thought is pizza. So it's not a wrong consciousness because it's not mistaken with respect to its object of engagement. But for example, like the example that Monlam gave about, the perception of the horns of a rabbit. The object of engagement is horns of a rabbit. So it's a wrong consciousness. If it's a perception of the horns of a rabbit, that means it's non-conceptual. So the appearing object would be horns of a rabbit as well. So it's mistaken also. The perception of the horns of a rabbit is mistaken with respect to its appearing object, and it's mistaken with respect to its object of engagement. So it's both a wrong consciousness and a mistaken consciousness. If it's appearing, and if we're saying I consciousness perceiving, no, if it's a thought of horns of a rabbit, then the appearing object would be a mental image of the horns of a rabbit. And so it's still mistaken. Okay? Yeah.
Well, what would be something that you've never seen before, to be a mistake or not mistake? Or could be just a totally new object?
Uh-huh. Well, if it's a totally new object that exists.
Maybe a totally new object.
Yeah.
A new animal that you've
Right.
never seen before.
Okay. So for that I consciousness, perceiving that totally new animal, that would not be mistaken, and that wouldn't be a wrong consciousness. You just don't have the label for it, right? So the example of horns of a rabbit is just the example that the Tibetans use for something that doesn't exist, right? But if it's something you've just never seen before and it exists, then that's not a wrong consciousness, and that's not a mistaken consciousness. Until their thought, then your thought labels it. Then it becomes a mistaken consciousness because it's a thought. Okay, Carol?
I'm getting a little confused because partly it was the horns of the rabbit thing, but I'm just thinking if the object is mental thought,
Yeah.
if the object is a mental thought, like say the horns of a rabbit. I mean, I can mentally think of that.
Yeah.
And if that's the object, and then the appearing object, it doesn't sound like it's on. Then the appearing object would be that mental image
Right.
of my mental image.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm getting lost as to why that's mistaken. I can see why, because there isn't, I mean, how do you, if thoughts can be objects or are viewed as objects, is that true? Or
Yeah,
when we talk
well-
about a mental image, when we talk about,
Yeah, when we talk about a mental image, we're actually not talking about a thought. We're talking about the object of a thought. So the mental image itself is like a picture, right?
so that
a mental
is
image,
always
yeah.
mistaken.
So the mental
because
image
it
is
isn't the object.
right. Because a thought, remember, a mental image is a permanent phenomenon, right? Whereas a thought is impermanent. Did I address your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
A mental image
Is a permanent phenomenon, right? It doesn't change from moment to moment,
but the thought is.
but a thought is impermanent. So the thought would be the subject or the object possessor, and the mental image would be its object. The subject is the thought, the object is a mental image. Okay, and we'll go through this again. So don't worry about getting everything right now. I'll go through this again and again and again, actually, in different contexts and in different ways. Okay, and then I'll just go through this briefly. They're mental versus sense consciousnesses. I think we understand what sense consciousnesses are, right? The eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. Consciousnesses that perceive forms and sounds, odors, tastes, and tangible objects. And we'll get into those a lot more later, but I just wanted to introduce these terms. So then a mental consciousness, right, can be either conceptual or non-conceptual. So an example of a non-conceptual mental consciousness would be like a direct perception of emptiness, for example. Those are a lot less common, right? Mostly our mental consciousnesses are conceptual. I can't exactly say that, but a yogic direct perceiver is a type of mental consciousness, right? But there's another kind of obscure example that we'll go through next time of a mental consciousness that's non-conceptual. And also clairvoyances. Clairvoyances of knowing others' minds and knowing past lives and etc. Those are considered non-conceptual mental consciousnesses. But we'll go through that next time as well. Okay. Now we'll go through another division, which is valid cognizers versus non-valid consciousnesses, or cognizers. And here, cognizer and consciousness are used interchangeably here. Right. And valid cognizers are what we want to cultivate, and obviously non-valid ones, not so much. I mean, another translation for this term is prime cognizer, which is actually, I think, more appropriate in this school. Because the definition of a valid cognizer in this school is a new, incontrovertible knower. And what does new mean? It means that the object of the consciousness is being met with or comprehended for the first time. So for an I consciousness perceiving this table, there are a continuum of moments of that I consciousness perceiving the table. The first moment is considered a valid or a prime cognizer. And the second, third, fourth, fifth moments are not prime cognizers. Because it's said that that first moment is more powerful. And then the subsequent moments are realizing what has already been realized, or knowing what's already been known before. And maybe an easier example to comprehend is a thought. Let's say there's this example of a friend of mine who had a wrong consciousness. She thought that this woman had stolen something from her. She had borrowed this piece of cloth, right? And had said she'd returned it, but my friend didn't believe her. She couldn't find and didn't believe her. And then one day she was going through her stuff and she found it. And she realized that that woman didn't in fact steal her cloth. So that first moment of finding it and realizing that that woman didn't steal the cloth, eliminated this kind of misconception of this woman having stolen her cloth, right? She had a misconception that this woman stole the cloth. So that first moment is said to eliminate that superimposition. But then subsequent moments of remembering that this woman didn't steal the cloth are induced by that first moment.
Yeah. The object of engagement, in respect to which that's the wrong view, is that her idea that the woman stole her purse? Is that the object of engagement?
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that. So that first moment is more powerful than the other moments, right? And it's said that when you directly realize emptiness, it's that first moment of directly realizing emptiness that is called the antidote to the obstructions. Right? And then the subsequent moments are abiding in that realization, but they're realizing something that's already been realized. The subsequent moments within that continuum. And the fact that this word new is in this definition kind of precludes subsequent cognizers from being valid cognizers. So subsequent cognizers would be, for example, the second moment onward of realizing that that woman didn't steal her cloth. The first moment of realizing that would be a valid cognizer or a prime cognizer, and the second moment onward would be a subsequent cognizer.
So when we divide it into valid and non-valid cognizer, that's not inclusive of all possibilities. Is a subsequent cognizer a non-valid cognizer?
Yeah, a subsequent cognizer is considered a non-valid cognizer, which is why I prefer the word prime, because a subsequent cognizer is still a realizing consciousness, but it's not the first moment. It's not a prime cognizer. So that word valid is misleading, I think, in this context.
Would you say that subsequent cognizer is a valid cognizer also?
No, the subsequent, no. We say, I mean, in this school we say no. It's not a quote-unquote valid cognizer, but it's a realizing consciousness. So it's, it's something still that you want to cultivate, but it's not what Geshe Rapton calls an ideal mind, right? Maybe that's another way of thinking about it, an ideal mind versus a non-ideal mind. It's not the perfect mind, because it's a subsequent cognizer is realizing something that's already been realized.
So is that kind of like remembering? Or is that completely?
No, it's not.
Or it's
No.
it's not conceptual?
It can be conceptual or it can be non-conceptual. Well, we'll talk about that more, but it's not a remembering consciousness. But it's induced by the first moment of realizing it. Okay, David.
So that word cognizer kind of is referring to the act of gaining this information, or like the prime cognizer is sort of like when you realize it.
Cognizer, cognizer in general just means a knower or a consciousness, right? So, but a prime cognizer or valid cognizer, that term implies it's something is being realized, right? But the word cognizer itself doesn't imply that at all.
If there's a new realization that occurs of like selflessness, is it possible to lose that? Is it possible to subsequently lose that realization, or that like epiphany, so to speak?
Yeah, and I think that that's a difference between a realization and an experience. Like we can have spiritual experiences that come and go. Recently I heard a Dharma teacher that talked about the difference between spiritual experiences and realizations. We can have these epiphanies or spiritual experiences, but they're impermanent. We can have great experiences during retreat, and then you go back to the real world and, the mind goes back to the way it was before. And so that's not a realization. A realization is something that's stable.
Yes, but when you go in a path of seeing, it's when you have that direct perception, so then you meditate on it. So that is to stabilize it. So the direct perception. And emptiness is considered entering the path of seeing. So that's got to be a realization.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's definitely a realization. When you directly realize emptiness,
But yeah,
that's a
you haven't
realization.
stabilized it yet, so that's what you do in the next path.
Right, but even that first moment of directly realizing emptiness, you've removed all the, oh, I shouldn't say removed all the superimpositions, but you will never again believe that things are not empty. You know, it's not stable in the sense of you can bring it up anytime you want, a direct realization of emptiness. But you will never believe in a conception of true existence again. So in that sense, it's stable. So if somebody comes up to you and says, no, things aren't empty, you know, things really exist, you would never believe them, right? And it's also said that, you know, a conception of true existence will still come up, you know, it will still arise, but a superior and Arya will never believe in that conception.
When you say never again, do you mean... When you say never again, do you mean even in future incarnations that a realization is going to, you know, from
You know, I can't, I don't know, you know, I really don't know how that all works. I wish I did, but I don't. Okay, let's move on. So incontrovertible, the word incontrovertible means that the cognizer has eliminated these superimpositions with regard to its object. Right? So eliminates, so for example, that direct realization of emptiness, you eliminate the superimposition that, you know, phenomena are truly existent.
Superimposition is like projection?
Superimposition, yeah, I guess you could say a projection. Yeah, something that you put on top of what actually exists. So that's where I was just talking about with regard to a conception of true existence still arises for a superior. And I'm talking from the Prasangika school, sorry. But you no longer believe in it, right? But these things still arise out of the habit, right? So this word incontrovertible means that it realizes its object. So for correctly assuming consciousnesses, you know, correctly assuming consciousnesses once again have a correct view, but they're not incontrovertible, which is why we need to develop realizations, right? And I was reading somewhere that it said that most of us on the path have correctly assuming consciousnesses. And then knower. Knower, we already talked about kind of what a knower is. But it's said in the text that this word eliminates or precludes physical sense powers from being valid cognizers. Because some non-Buddhist schools believe that sense powers are valid cognizers. And also, I think, the Vaibhashika school. And the physical sense powers are things like, they're very subtle matter. For example, there's an eye sense power. It's subtle matter that's kind of on the eyeball that we can't see. And that empowers an eye consciousness to be able to see. And we'll go into that in more detail next time. Okay, so there are two types of valid cognizers: direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers. Okay. And I emailed all these slides to people on my email list, so if you didn't get them, you know, let me know and I'll put you on the email list. So out of these 7 consciousnesses again, the first 3 are realizing consciousnesses. The first 2, direct perceivers and inferential cognizers. The first moment of each of those are prime cognizers or valid cognizers. And the second moment onwards are subsequent cognizers.
So is the direct perceiver and inferential cognizer the two that you had at the bottom under the 2 divisions? Because I got
Yeah.
ready.
I mean, not exactly. I mean, almost.
I missed almost the same, get that down.
So, direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers are the two divisions of valid cognizers. So direct valid cognizers are a subset of direct perceivers. Okay. So we'll start talking about direct perceivers in general first, and then we'll get into direct valid cognizers. So the definition of an awareness that is a direct perceiver is a knower that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. So we know what a knower is, or we've talked about it at least. Then free from conceptuality, right, once again means that the consciousness deals with the object directly and not by means of a mental image. And non-mistaken means that there's no erroneous element involved in that which is appearing to the consciousness.
So non-mistaken is referring to the object?
No, non-mistaken is always refers to the subject.
Means that there's no involved in that which is appearing to consciousness.
Right. So all conceptual consciousnesses are mistaken. Right.
Yeah, no, that is,
For example.
just trying to, there's no erroneous element involved in that which is.
Yeah, that's another way of saying that there's no mistake with respect to the appearing object. In more complicated words. Okay. Yeah, and you can say that actually, non-mistaken, or actually it's free from conceptuality, you can say that that's not really even necessary in that definition, because non-mistaken implies that it's free from conceptuality, right? But because of some kind of obscure position by some non-Buddhist Vaisheshikas, they had to include this in the definition. It's free from conceptuality. So, I mean, a question came up in my other class if direct perceiver and non-conceptual consciousness were synonymous, and they're not. Right? So if it's a direct perceiver, it's necessarily non-conceptual. But if it's non-conceptual, it's not necessarily a direct perceiver. So an example of that would be, for example, an eye consciousness that's kind of infected with jaundice. In a person who's infected with jaundice, everything appears to be yellow.
And that, by the way, is incorrect.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. I should have used a different example because we have a nurse in the room.
They do not see things yellow.
Okay. Okay. Right.
Got another one in her pocket.
That's all right. Okay, let's use. Okay. 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 Well, why don't we say, someone who's colorblind then, the things things appear to be a different color than they are, or black and white. I'm not sure how that works, but that would be an example of an eye consciousness that's mistaken, right? So it's non-conceptual, but it's not a direct perceiver. That's a wrong consciousness. So there are 4 divisions of direct perceivers. Actually, I think we'll go into that next time. that's enough to cover for today.
Do we have homework?
Oh, we did. Okay. No. You know, and if people want to stay and discuss the homework, they're very, very welcome to do that.
Yeah.
Because it's said that it's good to review the material within 24 hours of having heard it, you know? And then if you discuss it, you remember it a lot better.
Oh, you know, sorry.
I know, it's my fault. I should have handed half.
I thought you grabbed it. Bundle.
I think there's plenty for everything. If not, then I'll
Yeah.
take mine.
And David, I have the slides
Thank you very much.
from last time. I printed them out really small, I'm
Oh, that's
sorry. But
fine.
let me know if you can't read it and I can print them out.
I think I can
Bigger.
almost read it. No, I
Okay.
can- yeah.
Okay.
It's about the limit though.
Okay.
You can turn the recorder off.
Yeah, so we'll just, are there any questions before we finish? And we'll go into the different types of direct perceivers next time, and the difference between a direct perceiver and a direct valid cognizer. So we can cook it and ask the questions next time as well. Okay, maybe we just dedicate then.